Okay, so here's where we really start the course. This is really where we get into everything. Okay, so these are what I would call sort of foundational concepts, and we'll spend a few minutes talking about each as we go through, and really kind of talking about how they relate to the sort of nature of the course. All right, so incentives. Economists have this very boring statement, and every time I hear an economist say it, even I have to roll my eyes, although I find myself saying it all the time, which might mean that I roll my eyes at myself, which, may or may not be the most healthy thing to do. But anyway, so the basic statement is that incentives matter, right? Just incentives matter. That is that humans respond to incentives, and therefore the incentives themselves matter. They cause us to behave in certain ways. They cause us to change our behavior, or they cause us to maintain our behavior. So incentives sort of work in a lot of different ways. And I think what's most interesting about incentives is not that they matter, but that they matter at times in counterintuitive ways, or they matter in ways that we didn't necessarily predict. And that's very interesting. And one of the concepts that we'll talk about in the coming weeks is this concept called behavioral economics, which is this branch of economics that deals exactly with this particular question, which is, we know that humans respond to incentives. That is really kind of obvious. If a car is coming down the street, you don't cross the road, right? You wait for the car to pass, and then you cross, right? That's an incentive. I don't want to get run over. But when it comes to the more marginal sort of decisions, the decisions where there is no clear right or wrong, or better or worse, then you see sort of human incentives sort of behave in an interesting way. A good example of this that you'll read about in Freakonomics is this experience with an Israeli daycare where they were having a hard time with parents showing up late to pick their kids up. So the daycare center workers were having to stay later. It wasn't fun for them to have to stay after work. They wanted to go home. So what they decided to do was they would create a incentive mechanism that would, in their minds, reduce the incentive to show up late. An obvious one is a penalty, a fine. A monetary cost, which says that if you pick your child late up from daycare, we will charge you additional fees on top of what you're already paying to send your kid to daycare. So they put a relatively small fee, and after a while, the daycare noticed, much to their horror, that in fact the number of parents showing up to pick their kids up late increased. That in fact, parents responded to the fee by increasing the amount of times they were late. Now, aside from the possibility that there's no causation at all, that the incentive didn't increase or decrease, it just was happenstance that the parents started showing up late, aside from that possibility, what are other possibilities as to why a relatively small fee would cause parents to actually show up late more often, not less often? I'm not going to get too much into it because you're going to read about it in the chapter of Freakonomics, but it's just interesting. Again, to kind of think about economic incentives as something that we know matter, but we don't necessarily know why or how or in what specific ways they matter. And again, this is really where economics becomes very useful, because even though economics is trying to come up with a set of generalizable beliefs about human behavior, that is, that we want to come up with ways in which humans respond to incentives in ways that are generalizable, that we can say people tend to do this, right? So a good example of this is money. People tend to respond to money in similar ways. We certainly all have our own opinions on money, but for the most part, people tend to respond to incentives with respect to money in similar ways. We try to avoid incurring costs. We try to seek opportunity. Right? Generally speaking, that's the way it works. But in the Israeli daycare center, what you have is, in a sense, people behaving in the opposite of that potential incentive. And so that's very interesting and something that we'll talk about. In the 1800s, they had this situation with British prisoner ships that were being sent to Australia, where the incentive mechanism was simply the number of prisoners that showed up in Australia, dead or alive. So the British prisoner ship captains were paid basically on the number of bodies that showed up in Australia, whether they were alive or dead. There was no distinguishing between them. As a result, the British prisoner ship captains had little incentive to make sure that the conditions on board their ship were good for their prisoners, and there was no incentive for them to generally be taken care of. And so the British prisoner ship captains didn't take care of them. Terrible conditions on board the ships, and unfortunately a lot of prisoners died making the trip from Europe to Australia. There was a public outcry whenever this was unveiled, that this is what was going on, that there were all these prisoners dying on their way to Australia. As a result, the British government changed their policy, and instead, in a relatively straightforward way, you're probably already thinking about this, they said, well, it's not going to be the number of bodies, but it's going to be the number of alive people. So the British prisoner ship captains were instead paid not on the number of bodies, but on the number of alive bodies, which is, I think most of us would say a better sounding incentive mechanism. But this is important, right? This is, policy is all about trying to understand human incentives. If we're going to have a policy to create a better outcome. So if we want to, for example, talk about discrimination policy at workplaces, and we want to talk about which policies will actually reduce discrimination, it takes an understanding not only of discrimination, but also an understanding of what are the incentives in the workplace that create the opportunity for discrimination, and kind of understanding those and sort of working back from them. And sort of understanding that humans don't always respond to incentives in the ways that we think. And also, in fact, that sometimes when humans are responding to just pure incentives, it actually creates outcomes that may not necessarily be best for everyone in society. And so there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of kind of friction between what we think we know about the way humans behave and then kind of how humans behave. And this would be something that we continually come back to and talk about a lot. And then kind of one final example that I think is really interesting, the endangered species list, which of course is maintained by the U.S. government as well as alongside and in conjunction with several conservation groups and pro-animal groups, is a list that is supposed to reduce the speed at which animals are becoming extinct. In fact, they're supposed to. The goal, of course, is to do away with the threat of extinction. The idea is that an animal is put on the endangered species list. It sort of brings awareness that this animal is potentially going to be going extinct, and it also draws attention to the fact that habitat conservation is very important for this particular animal. The way the policy is actually set out, though, it has some unintended consequences. One of the most perhaps important is that if you own land that is designated as being the habitat of an endangered species, by law, you became responsible for that particular habitat. And at times this was a costly consideration, not only in terms of direct monetary costs, but also in terms of time. An example of this was in Oregon, where these farmers were having snow owl populations on their land who were then designated as endangered species. Unfortunately, what happened is because farmers saw the endangered species list as this additional cost to their farms, they would in fact adopt what came to be known as a policy of shoot, shovel, and shut up. I'm not going to go too much into that. You can imagine what shoot, shovel, and shut up means. But suffice it to say that we actually have some evidence there that the endangered species list actually increased the extinction rate of the white owl and, in fact, didn't decrease it. That we responded by changing parts of the law and making it more understanding of these particular situations. So that was dealt with, but it was dealt with by admitting, or at least acknowledging, that perhaps the initial incentive mechanism was bad, and therefore it's something that maybe we want to think about changing. You'll read about this in the Freakonomics chapter 1 that I'm going to assign for you after this lecture video, and you'll see this play out in a number of different ways. To see this kind of idea kind of brought completely forward, this idea of humans respond to incentives, let's play a game. We call this the grade game. Okay, so if you look at this, what we call payoff matrix, you'll see that there are essentially 2 rows and 2 columns. Here you have a row, another row, a column, and then another column. The way that you think about this is that you are going to respond by choosing alpha or beta. Okay, so everybody in the class will choose alpha or beta, and then I will collect your responses. Of course, you have to imagine that you're doing this because we're not in class, but I will then collect your responses, and then I will randomly pair you with someone else in class who, of course, has also responded, alpha or beta. Once I randomize you into pairs, I will then see what your responses are. If you both pick alpha, then this means you both get B minuses. The way you read the payoffs is that you always get the first payoff, your pair always gets the second payoff. So again, if you both pick alpha, you both get B minuses. On the same token, if you both pick beta, then you both get B pluses. The interesting part is when you pick differently. So if you pick alpha, and your beta picks, or excuse me, if you pick alpha and your pair picks beta, then you get an A. Again, your payoff is always the first one. You get an A and they get a C plus. If you pick beta and they pick alpha, then you get a C plus and they get an A. So you can see it's sort of the opposite, right? So when you both pick alpha, you both get B minuses. When you both pick beta, you get B pluses. When one of you picks alpha and the other picks beta, whoever picks beta gets a C plus. Whoever picked alpha gets an A. Okay? So at this moment, what I'd like you to do is pause the lecture video and just look at this payoff matrix. Make sure you understand what's going on here and think about it. Think about what you would pick between alpha or beta. Imagine that we were in class right now. I asked you to write down alpha or beta, and imagine that your grade literally depended on simply your answer and someone's randomized pair put together. So think about that. Pause the video. Think about what you would pick. Okay? And then when we come into class on the 17th, this is how we're going to start class. We'll start class by talking about the grade game. Okay. In the previous grade game, when you were thinking about what you would pick between alpha or beta, what you did was you created what we call a heuristic. You created a heuristic not only for yourself, but you also created a heuristic for your pair. Even though you don't know who your pair is, you know nothing about them, you created a heuristic. Now here, the heuristic is relatively simple. The heuristic is simply the outcomes of the game, and your probable assumption that you and your pair are behaving in your own self-interest. Simply meaning that you and your pair are trying to get the highest grade possible. You know, you have complete information. You know exactly what grade you'll get when you choose what you choose and what your pair chooses. So you can safely assume that the both of you are simply trying to maximize your grade, right? That's your goal. Get the highest grade possible. When we say what a heuristic is, we mean it's a mental model that we use to make predictions. We think about what we think will occur, and then we make predictions based upon that. In a sense, we're creating a theory. And oftentimes we don't get a chance to test the theory. We just see the theory, whether it plays out or not. In this scenario, when we talk about the grade game the next time we meet in class, we'll see how this game is likely to sort of play out, and we'll talk about why it's likely to play out that way. But the point here is to say that this idea of creating within your head a model of human behavior is something that you naturally do. It's something that you do instinctively. Go back to what I said previously about crossing the road. You naturally understand that before you cross the road, you should look both ways because you don't want to get hit by a car, right? That's a natural heuristic. You create a framework. Basically, the framework says the decision of whether I will cross the street or not will be determined by my belief about my chances of getting run over. If my belief about my chances of getting run over are low enough, then I will cross the street. However, if my belief about my chances of getting run over are in fact high enough, that in fact I think if I cross the street I might get hit, I'm not going to cross the street. I've created a heuristic, which then allows me to make predictions about relative probabilities. This all sounds very complicated, but essentially what it means is that everything exists as a probability. And sometimes you can do things to increase probabilities, so reduce the probability of getting hit by a car by looking both ways. Sometimes you can increase the probability of things. Increase the probability of being hit by a car by not looking both ways. This is ultimately how we're going to think about the concept of rationality. we're going to think about the fact that whenever we're trying to define whether something is or is not rational, we're simply creating a heuristic and applying our own, perhaps, subjective definition of rationality. And this is important when it comes time to design economic systems or design the policies that are meant to interact within that economic system. We're always thinking about heuristic creation and predictions. When policymakers create policies, what they're doing is they make predictions about behaviors. I think businesses will react this way to a tax cut. I think criminals will react this way to stiffer penalties. Whatever it is, you're trying to create predictions about behavior. If I own a business, my marketing is a response to predictions about human behavior. I market myself in a way that I think will increase people coming to my business. Therefore, I'm making a prediction about what I think people will be enticed by. And so, again, this seems like a relatively complicated concept, but it really isn't. And we do it so naturally that it really just takes a little bit of reflection on our own part to realize that we're doing this. And so this is all about kind of can we make predictions, and then are those predictions generalizable? In other words, are the predictions we made about person A similar to the predictions we made about person B, which would then be similar to the predictions about person C. The more generalizable our heuristic, the better it tends to be, the more flexible it tends to be. If our heuristic only works for a certain set of individuals, then that limits the applicability of our heuristic, but doesn't necessarily limit its usefulness. For example, if I'm a company and I'm thinking about marketing, I may try to market to distinct groups of individuals differently. I may try to market to old customers in a particular way while trying to market to young customers in a completely different way. That's fine. Oftentimes, however, we find it useful to have generalizable heuristics that apply to as broad a population as possible, whether that's with respect to marketing or whether that's with respect to governmental policy, or sort of a whole host of issues.